I'm Derek Chollet at GMF, and I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning and this afternoon for a book conversation with my friend Chris Brose to talk about his terrific new book, The Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. I'll try to get a good shot of it there in the camera. Chris is one of the brightest thinkers on U.S. national security generally, but defense policy specifically. He served for many years as a senior national security advisor to Senator John McCain. And the last 4 of those years, he was the staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which was one of the most important positions in the U.S. defense policy world. And in this book, Chris has written not a memoir, but a book that very much draws on his experiences working for Senator McCain and as staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And it is a bracing critique of U.S. defense policy and a sobering read about the challenges the United States and the transatlantic community more broadly face in the years to come. Our mutual friend, the Washington Post columnist David Ignatius, called this book the most provocative critique of U.S. defense policy that I've read in years. And having read this book, I can agree with that statement. So, Chris, congrats on the book. Thanks for writing it.
Thanks, Derek.
And what I'd like to do is start off with the title. I know that titles for books often there's a lot of energy and thought that goes into a title. Right. And The Kill Chain, which is something that would be familiar to folks who maybe served in the Pentagon or on the Senate Armed Services Committee, but may not be a familiar phrase for a broader audience. But nevertheless, you use it to great effect in this book. So let's first talk about what the kill chain is and how it applies to this larger story that you're telling.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for having me and the kind words. I really appreciate it. I went back and forth on the title. I wasn't sure I wanted to kind of ride out under the banner of the kill chain, but ultimately the reason I embraced it is I think because a lot of the criticism that I sort of put forward in the book has to do with the belief that, and what I saw in a long period of time in the Senate is that in sort of the construction and operation of military power, I think we focus way too much on inputs and not enough on outcomes. We think in terms of the vehicles we buy, the weapon systems, the platforms we buy. We define our requirements in the basis of that. We sort of build budgets on the basis of platforms. We kind of identify organizationally, bureaucratically, in terms of that. And ultimately, those are tools. They're important tools. They're expensive tools. They're tools that a lot of Americans build and operate, but they're ultimately inputs in the process. And the outcome that I think we build a military to accomplish, is this idea of the kill chain, which, like you said, I mean, most people who work in defense have heard it. Most people who do not have never heard of it. The idea is essentially it is a process that militaries engage in wherever they're competing militarily on a battlefield or otherwise. And the U.S. military will get very detailed and long multi-step technical process. But the reality, what I try to do in the book is kind of abstract it to the core ideas, which is basically understanding, just orienting yourself, getting an understanding of what's happening in the area that you're operating militarily, making decisions. So deciding what to do in a competition that you're engaged in, and then taking actions to create effects to achieve outcomes. And that process is inherently sequential. You don't want to make decisions prior to achieving understanding. And ultimately, what I liked about it was kind of 2 things. I mean, one, again, it is the way to think about how militaries actually achieve advantage. They don't achieve advantage by having the greater number of systems. They achieve advantage by increasing the quality and the speed by which they gain understanding, make decisions, take actions. I also felt it was a helpful way to think about this question of emerging technology. Something like artificial intelligence is significant because it's going to fundamentally transform the nature of understanding, decision-making, action It's going to affect all of those, kind of soup to nuts from the beginning to the end of that kill chain process. And then ultimately, finally, I again sort of embrace the idea because, at the end of the day, the US military, US national defense is just fundamentally unlike anything else in America. I mean, this does come down to a matter of war and peace, life and death, and the question of, where human beings kind of, sort of situate themselves inside of that process, especially as technologies, autonomous systems, artificial intelligence enable machines to become more capable of doing military tasks. Personally, I think it's helpful to continuously orient, kind of what we are trying to do with these technologies around the human being. This is about improving human understanding and human decision-making and ensuring that the actions we take militarily are initiated through human agency and are ultimately something that human beings are accountable for.
Well, I definitely want to get into this question of automation and how we should think about that in terms of the future of warfare. But before I get to that, I want to get back to the kind of the fundamental idea of the book, which it's been described as a wake-up call to not just the defense establishment, but to all Americans. And you write about what you describe as a systemic failure of the U.S. defense establishment. So if it is a wake-up call, first describe how we fell into the slumber, and what do we need to be alerted to?
Yeah, I think the concern that I had, as I worked for the better part of a decade in the Senate, was that we were increasingly disconnected from what I saw to be kind of the largest problem we faced. And it wasn't because people weren't paying attention. It wasn't because people were, kind of unpatriotic or stupid, far from it. And this is as much a criticism of me as it is of anybody else. I mean, I lived through this. I worked through this time and experience as well. What was striking to me in writing the book was how consistently since the end of the Cold War, we have been saying the same things about what is important and then consistently not doing so many of those things. The recognition that the rise of China was going to be, a fundamental transformation of world politics. Looking at the way that they had systematically been building and transforming their military, again, really since the end of the first Gulf War in 1991. Just with accelerating degrees and sort of improving military capability that they continuously push out, purpose-built to focus on undermining how the United States builds and operates our military. Obviously, for the better part of 2 decades, we were focused on the events of 9/11, the aftermath, the wars that followed. And that was, as you know as well as anybody, I mean, a significant amount of human time, attention, focus, urgency. I think the broader reason that I kind of point to in the book was, I think there's an extent to which, America was spoiled by its own dominance. We came out of the Cold War, the first Gulf War, just so militarily superior. So sort of geopolitically, geostrategically dominant, that I think it began to just kind of dull our sense of, our kind of competitive edge. We sort of discounted the idea that we could be caught, that we could be surpassed, that we weren't going to have a military, or that we were going to have a military that might actually have to confront, peer competitors with military technological parity to us. And it's not to say that we're there now, but it's something that I think is coming. And I think that, kind of all together, led to, just kind of missing things that were happening, not sort of giving them the sense of attention and urgency that we needed. But again, like I go back to the point that I made at the beginning, I think the broader systemic failure on a military basis has to do with the fact that we focus too much on the inputs and not enough on the outcomes. That we're too sort of hidebound and focused on the way we've always done things and the things we've always relied upon to do them. And I think that is reinforced by the way we budget for military systems, the way the Congress operates and functions, the kind of significant role that, the private sector, defense industry, external stakeholders have on that process, it is incredibly difficult to change. And to some extent for good reason, right? I mean, bad change and change that happens recklessly costs people's lives in this venture. But I think, the ultimate problem was the only way that you change something that is this difficult to change is through a fundamental belief that there's something worse than not changing. And I think for a very long period of time, we didn't really have that. And to some extent, I think we're starting to wake up to that, but I'm still not sure we're totally there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to get into the mistakes we've made in terms of our attempts to change or lack thereof. But before I get to that, just to drill down a little further on China and Russia, which are the two principal threats, China mainly, that you talk about in the book. What had they been able to do that is most concerning to you to take away America's military advantage? And how were they able to do it?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I think one that deserves a lot more consideration than what I give it in the book. I think there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, one is at the level of strategy. I think China in particular, for the better part of 3 decades, has not been seeking to play the same game that the U.S. has played. They've sought to play a different game. They've sought to play a disruptor's game, and they have gone to school on us, and they have developed a very good understanding of how we field military systems and operate military systems and engage in combat operations. And they have purpose-built a military to undermine kind of the way that America projects military power. And it's been methodical and systemic and concerted for 3 decades now. So again, at that strategic level, they've sought to disrupt the way we've operated. They've sought to play a different game and increasingly put us in the position of playing a losing game, where if we just keep doubling down on the ways we operate, the things we use to operate, we're just going to make things worse for ourselves. I think to some extent it also has to do with technology. We've seen since really since the 1980s, 1990s, kind of a proliferation of precision strike warfare. We've believed that this was sort of the core competence and sort of the monopoly of the United States military. And we sort of demonstrate this time and time again. And the reality is that those technologies, from kind of long range sensing to precision guided weapons to kind of information networks that can communicate that information, these have been proliferating for 3 decades now. So I think when you look at what China has done, to a lesser extent, I think Russia has done a version of the same thing. They have built what Soviet military sort of theorists referred to as the reconnaissance strike complex, which was something that I think the U.S. defense establishment was very focused on in the early 1990s, of finding targets on the battlefield and very rapidly getting that targeting information to human beings and weapons that can do something about it. And again, just accelerating that process, that ability to understand, decide, and act, kind of move through that kill chain process. That's something that they've been working on for a long time, and they've moved with a sense of urgency. I mean, I spend a lot of time on China in the book, but with respect to Russia, the Russian military that went into Georgia in 2008 was fundamentally different than the Russian military that went into Ukraine in 2014. That's a 6-year period. And again, I mean, you know a lot more about that. You lived that experience, even more than I did. They did a lot to overhaul their doctrine, their technology, their training. And I think ultimately it has to do with the focus that they brought to that. I mean, this was a priority for them. Change was hard for them too, but they managed to work through it because they had the belief that this was something they had to do to undermine U.S. power or balance U.S. power.
And yeah, I should note that you have a very evocative section on the Ukraine crisis from February 2014, and the way the Russians were able to innovate and apply that on the battlefield. But rather than go to that example, I want to push to the U.S. modernization effort, because you make the very important point that it's not as though the U.S. has been standing in place. It's been trying to quote unquote modernize. What you're challenging is this notion that followed smartly, and that there was an attempt to modernize in the wrong ways
Right.
over the last 20 years or so. So I guess to your mind, what are the biggest white elephants out there? What are the things we poured a lot of money into that don't make a lot of sense for preparing for the future that you're painting here? And why did they prove so resilient? And then I guess to mix my metaphors a bit, what are the sacred cows that you would go after, right? If you were sitting in the E-ring right now at the Pentagon.
Yeah. Great question. I think there's a belief in the U.S. defense world that the reason we aren't where we are from a defense modernization standpoint has to do with the fact that there was no money for the military before 9/11, and then after 9/11, all the money that went into the military went into Iraq and Afghanistan and counterterrorism operations globally. And there's some truth to that. I mean, obviously, we spent a significant amount of money on the kind of the wars after 9/11, but at the same exact time, the preponderance of defense spending was actually going to things that were very much not entirely focused on the wars we were fighting. We were spending a lot of money on military modernization. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars. And a lot of those systems, the F-35, the Ford-class aircraft carrier, large deck amphibs, the KC-46 refueling tanker, the littoral combat ship, and then just a litany of satellites and intelligence and communications, networking technologies, software programs, battle management programs, things that most Americans have never even heard of before, which we have financed to an enormous extent, and to some extent those are actually where some of our largest failures have been. I think part of the problem was that we were trying to modernize in the wrong ways, in the sense that all too often we were trying to take systems that we had used for decades in many cases and make them incrementally better, or to transform them, quote unquote. But what we meant by transformation was not something that I would consider to be truly transformational in the sense of, going from manned aviation to unmanned or autonomous aviation. I mean, we did some of that, but it was primarily around, kind of taking components of systems like the catapult and sort of arresting gear on the aircraft carrier, and spending a significant amount of money to make those transformational components. But at the end of the day, they're still launching and recovering manned aircraft. They're still operating in a $14 billion weapons platform that is becoming increasingly harder and harder to get close into the challenges that those systems are going to have to operate in. I think that, kind of when you step back and look at it, there were also a lot of things that we were doing that truly were or had the potential to be transformational. And they were consistently underfunded, short run, delayed, cut off completely. And this had to do with, autonomous aircraft that the Air Force and the Navy experimented with, kind of longer range, more autonomous weapons, other things to that extent. That just consistently lacked the funding, didn't transition into larger and larger programs. So I think part of the problem was kind of the way we thought about this, the way we went about it. And I think the problem that we now find ourselves in, and I think this is the broader diagnosis, is that we operated under this belief that we could sort of perfectly predict the future, and the kinds of weapon systems that we were going to need 10, 15, 20 years down the road, things that were going to be in service for even longer than that. And it's a fundamentally hubristic way of thinking. And it's completely anathema to how technology is actually built. I joke that if I had to define my own requirements for my own mobile device 10 years ago, I would have the best flip phone in America right now. We were not open to what was happening in commercial technology, the way technology was rapidly evolving, and the ways that we could do different things with that militarily. So to answer your question, what would I go after? And I think, we can talk more about this, but I think this question is now particularly acute in the aftermath, or not even the aftermath, but whenever we get to the aftermath of the COVID crisis.
Hmm.
We were in a pretty dire fiscal situation before we moved several $1 trillion out the door of economic stimulus.
Hmm.
The defense budget was already plateauing and beginning to turn down prior to COVID. And I think, that is only going to accelerate and starken in the years to come. So this question that really is going to confront the next administration, whichever party that happens to be, is how do I think through the military that I need to have at a time where budgets are going to be declining as far into the future as I think many of us are comfortable making predictions. And I think the only way that we're going to be able to address that is we're going to have to cut into legacy force structure. So when you look at large deck carriers, large deck amphibs, short range tactical fighter aircraft, manned fighter aircraft, these kinds of systems, manpower, the number of people that we have in our military, particularly at a time where, autonomy and automation is making it capable for smaller numbers of humans to operate larger numbers of, machines on their own. I think there's no way that we're going to, kind of close the gap or sort of close the defense program with the resources that are available without going into some of these large, very expensive legacy military systems.
Yeah. Well, on that point, I would like to talk a little bit about robots or intelligent machines. Where you've touched on it a bit, but give us some examples of where should we be automating more?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's kind of to go back to where we started with the kind of the idea of the kill chain.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I kind of embrace that as a concept is because I actually think it's a helpful way of thinking through the impact that these kinds of technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, machine learning, and machine autonomy, are going to have. This is fundamentally going to change the way human beings understand the world and their environment, how they kind of make and communicate decisions, and the actions they take. And I try to consistently take a human-centric view of this, because at the end of the day, this is all about human beings, human agency, human accountability, writ large, but especially in matters of war and peace and life and death in the military. I think that what I have seen in the United States military, and I've never served, but I've spent a lot of time around the military like you have, is you have an enormous amount of remarkable human beings who are spending far too much of their time doing repetitive, menial, technical tasks that frankly are not the reason they joined the military and not necessarily the thing they want to be doing. And it's that very manual, very time intensive, very slow, very expensive process of generating understanding, looking at sensors, trying to interpret, where's the needle in the haystack in a very manual way, trying to make systems that don't naturally interoperate because they weren't built that way.
Yeah, you gave a great example about traveling through all the different ops centers around the world, U.S. military ops centers, and how you have service members taking inputs from multiple sensors and trying to hand input those, and not only how labor intensive but inefficient that is, and prone to mistakes.
And just heartbreaking. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, these are like the best that our country has to offer, and we are forcing them to work in ways with technology, that is in many cases years behind the state of the art, and just forcing them to take on a significant cognitive burden to do their jobs, to make their systems collaborate, share information, partly because they weren't built to do that. So to your point, you have literally human beings inside of every loop having to take information from one automated system and send it into another. We're generating huge amounts of data that we can't do anything with, because the ways in which we're trying to exploit that and turn it into military advantages, again, highly manual, highly slow. So, to answer your question, I think, the thing that, these technologies, autonomy, artificial intelligence, fundamentally, I think the value of them is going to be lightening the cognitive burden on human operators so that you can more clearly delineate the things machines can do and should do, and the things that we need human beings to do.
Hmm.
We need human beings in the military to make operational and ethical and tactical and strategic decisions. We don't need them looking at 12 hours of full motion video to figure out whether the guy who went into the house is the guy that came out of the house 7 hours later.
Hmm.
That is actually something that a machine has become very capable of doing, which isn't to say that we're going to trust it. It is to say that you can offload some of that task, delegate some of that task to a more intelligent machine to look at all of those hours of information and provide you a subset of that data to say, here are the 5 things that I found that were a little anomalous, that were a little interesting, that I think you should interrogate further.
Hmm.
So you can take large data sets and sort of neck them down to smaller numbers of things that humans can focus on. So again, you're optimizing where the human needs to sit in that process of understanding decision making and action. And look, this isn't something that we're going to flip the switch and immediately make a transition like this. And this is the thing I try to kind of call out in the book is, the United States military in particular is very deliberate about delegating any task, any military task, whether it's to a human being or to a machine. And that process only happens when there has been a significant amount of training, testing, and sort of the building of trust that the subordinate actor or the machine or the human being that you're delegating a task to is actually capable of performing that task effectively, repeatably, efficiently, et cetera. So, I think that's the value that we're going to see in this, is that it is going to accelerate and improve sort of where that human being sits in that kill chain process of understanding decision making and action.
Well, what I'd like to do is turn to some of the audience questions that have come in, and I encourage folks to use the Q&A function to offer some questions. And what I'd like to do is build on a question that's come in from Jeff Rathke about allies and the importance of allies, which is, of course, on the minds of probably many of our watchers today. And you do make a very clear statement in this book on the importance of alliances and how, in a sense, that's a U.S. unique capability.
Yeah.
But as Jeff notes, you rightly criticize the focus on inputs versus outcomes. And then he's interested in how you would extend this analysis to U.S. alliance policy. In other words, are we too focused on 2%, on the 2% of GDP for NATO, and not enough on the outputs? And if so, what needs to change in those contexts, and how do we have the capacity to lead that change effectively with our European and Indo-Pacific allies?
Yeah. So yeah, what I argue in the book is that we pay a lot of lip service to allies, but when we really look at how we plan to operate, the degree to which we have included our allies, particularly our transatlantic allies, in operational planning, burden sharing, when we look at the sort of the ways that we still, I think, pull too many punches on technology transfer, arms sales.
Right.
We, on the one hand, sort of bemoan that our military or our allies are not as militarily capable as we want them to be, but then we turn around and refuse to sell them, some of our more advanced systems or offensive systems for lack or for fear of kind of disturbing regional balance or, sort of creating a situation where they might take a provocative action that we don't think is in our interest. And that's actually not an illegitimate concern. But it's to say that I think we now need to reassess kind of where we've come down on the balance of that risk. I think we need to do a lot more, and we can do a lot more to empower our allies, kind of increase the connectivity between us, bring them into sort of U.S. war planning, operational planning. And I think that's starting to happen, but in my opinion, I mean, it's still, nowhere close to what it's going to need to be, because like at the end of the day, when you're talking about balancing Chinese power, when you're talking about deterring conflict in Europe, in Asia, I just think that to some extent it becomes arithmetic. Like you just need the multiplying effect and the multiplying power of the United States plus the transatlantic alliance in the European theater or our core allies and partners in the Asia Pacific. You just need greater mass, and the only way you get mass is by increasing your ability to operate with allies. So, on the question of inputs and outcomes, I mean, the 2% has been a bugaboo of mine for a very long time. I understand why we fixate on it. It's measurable. It's the same reason we fixate on a 355 ship Navy and a 386 squadron Air Force. You can count it. You can kind of, very quickly on a sheet of paper determine, kind of who's right and who's wrong. It's just, in my opinion, measuring the wrong things. Mm-hmm. There are NATO allies who are spending less than 2%, and there are some who are spending more than 2%. There are some whose militaries I will take every day in the week and twice on Sunday, who are below 2% because what they're spending on is real warfighting capability. That is something that the United States can operate with. That's something that I think we need to do a better job of, at the strategic and operational level, to really think through, how is this alliance going to conduct military operations together, mm-hmm. not how. And what do we need to do? I don't think it's a case that everybody has to do everything equally well, nor is it the case that everybody should have kind of advanced strike capabilities because that's something that everyone should be deemed to have. I'm okay with role playing. I'm okay with people doing certain things but not other things, so long as it's deliberate and thoughtful and it's sort of part of a strategic framework that the part or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot that we need to do from the standpoint of thinking through the outcomes we need to achieve from a conventional deterrence standpoint, and sort of who needs to do what, and what more the United States can do to kind of enable and empower our allies to do more of the things that we keep saying we want them to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just one editorial comment on the 2%. We could see in the coming year some countries are going to look a little better on 2% as their GDP goes down and their defense spending holds flat without doing anything different.
And we saw this in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis.
Right.
Where all of a sudden you had some NATO allies that were spending more than 2% because their GDP had collapsed. Like that's not a definition of success.
Right. Exactly.
That's right.
I'd like to ask you, this is more on the level of kind of grand strategy, so to speak. You talk about in the book that the U.S. needs to be thinking about a strategy that's about, you call it defense without dominance. And you've alluded to it already this morning, but in some cases, you say this is strategies about choices, and in some cases, the U.S. military is going to have to do less.
Right.
And you're very clear that we shouldn't be thinking we don't want war with Iran, we don't want a military regime change in Venezuela or North Korea necessarily. But so describe what you mean by defense about dominance and how you see that argument fitting within this broader debate about U.S. grand strategy.
Yeah. So I focus a lot in the book on China. Obviously the focus for me is also on Russia. I think they're sort of different problems, even though they're kind of similar. They're both problems. When I kind of look at the rise of China in particular, we talk about it a lot as a great power, as a return of great power competition. And I think that actually, it understates the case in terms of what we're dealing with in the Asia Pacific right now. The Soviet Union was a great power, but at the peak of its power, it was 40% of US GDP. It was disconnected largely from the international economy and didn't really have a robust base of domestic technological innovation. China has already surpassed us in terms of purchasing power parity. If kind of current trends persist, it's predicted that they will equal US GDP within a decade. They're integrated into the global economy largely through 4 decades of US policy to achieve exactly that outcome. And technologically, yes, they've stolen a lot of intellectual property from around the world, but they're also building world-leading companies and leading the development of artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies. I think the challenge that China poses strategically, economically, militarily, technologically, et cetera, is something that, my concern watching this in the Senate was that we tended to treat this, I felt like the way we talked about it was just sort of another foreign policy challenge that we had.
Yeah.
And it wasn't going to force us to fundamentally reevaluate all of our other extracurricular activities. And, where I've ultimately come out on this is that I believe it is the central focus or needs to be the central focus of U.S. foreign policy. And to do that and do that well, it's not going to be that, we're going to get to do everything that we want. We're going to have to prioritize, especially as resources come down. That's going to mean that we are going to have less money to spend, less bandwidth, less senior leader, time to focus on these other cases. And I would argue that, where we have to subordinate other interests to, an overriding priority like, deterrence in Europe, deterrence in Asia, that is going to necessitate doing fewer things. It's going to necessitate taking mission off of the United States military so we can conserve our power for the areas where we need to prioritize, those military capabilities. I think that's something that there's a general recognition of that. I mean, I think to a large extent, frankly, we've been saying that since the Obama administration. To some extent, it's the basis on which President Trump got elected. But I think when you really kind of run that through and say, okay, well, what is it really going to mean for me? I mean, to me, it leads me to make the kinds of choices that you just suggested. I wasn't a fan of the Iran nuclear agreement. But if the question is, do I want to get out of it once I'm in it, at the risk of, having to commit more military power, at the risk of, the potential of conflict that could, tax the U.S. military and draw them away from where I think the focus needs to be, or similarly with North Korea, they're, where they are in their nuclear program. It's been a long time coming. If the question is, do I want the United States military to have to go to war to prevent that nuclear capability, or that them developing a capability to, put a nuclear weapon on an ICBM that could target the United States? I mean, my answer would be, let's go back to strategic deterrence. It's prevented this kind of conflict for a very long time. It's probably the one policy that we've had with North Korea that hasn't failed. Let's think about this through the lens of what our choices are going to mean for the other things that we say are important. And if those things really are important, then we have to start subordinating other spending, other priorities, other interests, other desires, to those higher level priorities.
So I'd like to tie this conversation on defense without dominance to the earlier discussion we had on allies, because of course one of the issues that's come up quite a bit in the last few years, including particularly in the last 2 weeks or so, is the presence of U.S. forces around the world. And you make note in the book, you say we should become less focused on quote unquote presence. But then you also make clear that being forward deployed is important for dealing with a challenge like China. So talk us through a bit how you see how the U.S. military should be postured abroad. And, so to take a specific example, is it a bad thing that we're pulling out 9,500 troops from Germany? Do we need 50 to 60,000 troops permanently in the Middle East? How in this, if we were to do the things that you're suggesting we need to do to effectively confront a rising challenge from China, what would it look like for the U.S. military's posture abroad?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there's we could go down a lot of rabbit holes in terms of the specifics of that. I mean, I think the broader point that I'd make is with regard to presence. I feel like, for a very long time, we have tended to conflate presence with deterrence. That simply by being present in sort of an overt way, kind of a large number of forces stationed in, whether it's Japan or Germany or the Middle East, conducting freedom of navigation operations, kind of port calls, showing the flag. Look, there's a degree of reassurance that I think we create for our allies in that regard. And that's not to downplay that. But I think ultimately you do that over a long enough period of time, and Russia in the context of Europe or China in the context of Asia just bakes that into their considerations about us. I think the bigger question is, what are we doing together with our allies and partners to create deterrence, which ultimately exists in the mind of the competitor, where every day they wake up and say, this does not feel like a good day that I want to tangle with the United States and its allies and partners. And I think that's done less through, kind of overt, routine, predictable military presence, and it's done more through the selected sort of revealing of military capabilities, not just kind of individual weapon systems, but the ability to do something militarily, to bring together a collection of military systems, or to conduct an operation or a demonstration of capability that again creates that effect in the mind of the adversary or the competitor that if things came to the level of conflict, they would lose. Mm-hmm. And that's ultimately, I think, the way we need to be thinking more with our allies and partners in Europe, our allies and partners in the Asia Pacific. What that's ultimately going to mean for, how many American forces do we have on Guam, or, how many in Kuwait, or how many do we need in Germany? I do think it can and should probably lead to changes. Mm-hmm. But those, in many cases, those could be changes that necessitate larger forward presence. Sure. I'm not trying to suggest that it's sort of a come home America, sure, kind of bring it all back. And, yeah, and I actually explicitly kind of argue the opposite in the book, which is when you look at, again, the way Russia, China have built their militaries, they are trying to take away the core advantages that we have had for a very long period of time, which have to do with sanctuary, timing, and military dominance. Mm-hmm. And if sanctuary is not something we're going to have in our forward operations or our forward bases, if we're not going to be able to fight wars on these kind of month-long build-up timelines that we've had, and sort of long movements of force across the Atlantic or the Pacific to get into place to conduct operations, to me, the only answer is we're going to have a lot more forces forward right at the point of contact, right where they're needed, as well as the ability to generate forces, and through advanced manufacturing or other things that are going to allow us to sort of move the production of military capability forward. And everything that I think that implies with the level of connectivity, interoperability, at a military level, but down to an industrial base level with our allies and partners in their own countries, because we're just not going to have the luxury of operating the way that we used to, where we kind of assume that, well, when the war starts, 6 months after we kind of magic the force into position, right, we'll get rocking and rolling. That just isn't the world we live in anymore. Right. So I think that is going to necessitate a lot more military force forward. The flip side of that, though, is that it is going to make us much more dependent upon the diplomatic, political sensitivities, preferences of our allies and partners, because mm-hmm, ultimately what we're talking about is, in many cases, a larger scale presence of actual military or U.S. combat power in host nations. Mm-hmm. And that's something that is inherently challenging. Again, you dealt with that challenge far more than I have. I think that's going to become a challenge we're going to have to navigate more in the future, not less.
Yeah, which is definitely, it's a really smart point, and it builds on an earlier comment you made of the importance of pushing the conversation with our allies and partners now on these questions about autonomous weaponry and what the ethical framework around the use would be, because if they're going to be stationed in various parts of the world, that's going to be important that we're all on the same page.
Right.
There's you talk a lot about change in this book. I mean, this book's all about change, and in many ways it's also a story of resistance to change. And one of the questions that's come in from Eleanor Conrad is and I should note, is to set up this question, that you're joining us this morning and this afternoon, if you're in Europe, from California. So it's not even 7 a.m. And you now currently work for a technology company that is trying to push many of these innovations in the defense space. And just your observation, do you see a disconnect between the way those with military experience and those who don't have military experience, perhaps in California and elsewhere, visualize modernizing the military? And where does the resistance come from this kind of innovation that you're talking about culturally?
I think culturally it stems from change is just hard. I mean, it's always hard. I mean, it's hard in the commercial world. Yeah. you know, businesses have their business models disrupted every day. It's just difficult to change, particularly when you know, the disruptor is you know, it's lighter, faster, newer, you know, able to move quicker. I think the process of change is harder in the defense world because you know, look, if I'm too slow to change my internet service at home, you know, my kids will be disconnected from their iPad for a day or so. Like, it's a risk I can suffer. You know, if you're too slow to change, or rather, if you're too fast to change, or if you change in the wrong ways militarily, you know, we're ultimately talking about people's lives that are at risk. You know, that if you field a system that's not ready, if you cut away and divest from a military system that we've had and sort of used for a very long time, in the absence of a better capability that's available, you end up putting you know, a military operator in a very bad position. So I understand the reasons for you know, the reasons why change is hard in a defense bureaucracy. I think that to some extent, you know, again, it's back to this question of, we have become so enamored of the things that we use that we have almost come to believe, or it's been hard for us to believe, that we might not need those things in the future. You know, a mutual friend of ours calls it falling in love with our pets. It's just, you know, you know, we've always used certain kinds of weapons, and we can't imagine a world in which those weapons are less relevant or irrelevant. You know, to the point about technology and sort of the potential disconnect between the technology community and the military, I think, you know, for a long time that disconnect has been growing, and you know, I believe it's gotten pretty bad. But at the same time, I think what's heartening to me and what I see every day is, look, the technology community in America is no more monolithic than Washington, D.C. You know, it's a very diverse place. You have a lot of different opinions. You know, and much like Washington, D.C., you know, a lot of the bandwidth and the oxygen is taken out of the room by, you know, very small vocal minorities. Yeah. So when you look at the people who sign letters to their companies saying they should have nothing to do with the Department of Defense and the U.S. military, yeah, it's a few thousand people, but the company is a few 100,000 people. You know, this isn't necessarily representative of every engineer in America. And I think the reality that I've seen is that there are tons of engineers, young engineers, who are excited to do defense work. They're excited because they believe it's the right thing to do. They're excited because they think they could actually succeed and you know, build a successful company doing it. And in many cases, they're excited because they're engineers, and the reason they became engineers is because they're attracted to hard problems. And defense has really hard problems. I think the failure has been that on the defense establishment side in Washington, DoD, Congress, defense industry, we've just made it so difficult for people to do this work. The timelines are so long. So often we, you know, we start little interesting research projects or, you know, kind of new prototype military capabilities, and they never scale into anything. They never transition into larger scale programs that enable companies to transition into larger companies and employ more people. Like, we've just fundamentally gotten the incentives wrong. And I think that's why you've seen so many engineers, so many founders, so many companies, so many investors walk away from defense over the past 3 decades. It's not because they, you know, they're unpatriotic. It's because they don't believe that they can actually be successful doing this work. And unfortunately, there's like 3 decades of empirical evidence that suggests they're not wrong. Right. So if we want to change this, you know, we've got to change it, you know, at that basic level of incentives, to make it easier to identify the things that really are differentiating and game changing, so that you know, we're scaling things more quickly. You know, we're trying to kind of reshape the industrial base more deliberately. Those are the kinds of things that, you know, ultimately have to come out of Washington. Yeah. And then I think you'll start to see, you know, better responses as those incentives are set differently.
Well, I'd like to drill down on this issue of the structural resistance to change. So the question came at us in terms of the cultural resistance, but I think one of the things you do very effectively in this book is you're able to convey your experiences being in the the sausage making factory when you were on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, to really educate readers about the budget process, which sounds very unsexy, but is very, very important. And when you're dealing with billions of dollars, hugely consequential.
Yeah.
So I guess just as a very general matter, like what's the most broken aspect of the U.S. defense budget process? And you've suggested some of this in terms of the skewed incentives that it offers. But if we could fix that, understanding it's easier to say you're going to fix it than actually do it, given all the interests involved. But
Yeah.
if there were to be some fixes that are required, what would those be?
Man, it's
where to start? Where to start? Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I guess what I'd sum it up as, it's sort of a more conceptual answer, but I think the process is built and optimized around efficiency, cost accounting, sort of deliberate planning, being able to know how I'm going to spend all of my money in a year or 2 or 3 years from now, ensuring that we don't have waste, fraud, abuse, cost overruns in programs, and again, these are not bad things. I think the problem is that what it leads to is a very sort of bottom up process that too often just kind of recycles outcomes from one year to the next. It disempowers senior leaders to actually make decisions thoughtfully and deliberately on the basis of data. Too often, I mean, I was just shocked at the extent to which the Secretary of Defense would weigh in on his defense or her defense budget with sort of a month before it had to get sent over to Congress, and ultimately was sort of tweaking around 1 or 2% of the spending. And it's just like, find me a high performing organization in America that sort of organizes itself this way.
Right.
I think the bigger problem is that, it kind of goes back to this question of inputs and outcomes. We are fundamentally set up to measure inputs and determine how many of those inputs we want. And it's very difficult to change what those inputs are. Whereas, we don't do enough, in my opinion, to make decisions based on real decisions that drive, programmatic choices and trade-offs, resourcing choices and trade-offs around the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and the capabilities that we can generate right now based on what is currently state of the art. So you see, so many military systems, so many military programs that are built in a way that, there's a competitive process on the front end. You pick a winner, and the expectation is that winner is going to perform for 5 to 10 years. Whereas, look, defense is not a free market, but it does respond to incentives. There are so many of those programs that we could open up and say, we are going to compete this on the base of actual performance every single year. It's like the democratic process, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we're going to hold an election. Everyone knows what the ground rules are. Everyone knows how we adjudicate winners and losers. To the winner go the spoils this year, but if you lost, increase, step up your game and come back next year, and you'll have an opportunity to compete on the level playing field and take back power.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to bring that kind of mindset, I think, to much more of the way we build military programs, both from a technological sense, because it's going to allow you to constantly on-ramp better and better technology into the force, but also from a programmatic sense that you don't end up, sort of locked in and captured by legacy technology without a lot of incentive for the performer on that program to actually provide better and better capability. You end up sort of resting on your laurels and just building the thing that was new, 5 years ago when you won the contract.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of worked for us, in the 1990s because we were laps ahead of the competition.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work for us today.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to change that process, and I think doing that across more and more programs gets you into a place where you're more dynamically able to say, the reason we need to put $1 billion into this particular program is because, did you see what it was capable of doing 3 months ago? Like, it beat the competition.
Right.
These are things that I think we need to do a better job of, and ultimately, I think just at a higher level, the process just needs to be much more strategically driven.
Yeah.
We write strategies, but far too often those strategies are just fundamentally disconnected from
The
the
budgeting.
ways in which the bureaucracy makes programmatic and budgeting and personnel and operational decisions. That's at a bureaucratic sort of inside DoD and frankly inside the Congress level, where the things that senior leaders think and say they want to do and the sort of decisions that they need to own and be accountable for, we don't have the mechanisms to sort of drive that into the bureaucracy in a way that, exactly as you said, I mean, drives resourcing and programmatic choices consistent with what they themselves say they want to do strategically.
Yeah, I mean, a budget without a strategy is numbers, and a strategy without a budget is an essay.
Correct.
Last question. In building on this, and it's really a question about resources and how we should be thinking about security. And this is something, Chris, I've been puzzling over a bit. As I've reflected on the last 4 months of our lives, and if you look at 130,000 Americans dead, probably 200,000 or north of 200,000 in the transatlantic space, more disruption to our daily lives, to more destruction of our economies in the last 4 months than any conventional power, I would posit, could have done in that time frame.
Yep.
And so if you think of the most important job of a government is to keep citizens secure, how do you think it should change the way we think about security? And you make very clear in this book, even though it is a book about defense, that you're not arguing that it's all about defense, and that,
right.
that national security budget generally matters a lot. And you served in the State Department for 2 secretaries of state. So you're well aware of the importance of the State Department, and you've stressed the importance of diplomacy and development in this conversation. But as we're entering this period of severe austerity, and as we're being reminded every day of how insecure we can be based on a threat that's not a military threat, how should we be thinking about these resource allocations down the road?
Yeah, it's
and this is kind of, I don't have an answer for it either. I'm just reflecting on it.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this too, and I guess I have 2 answers. I mean, one is exactly what you said, right? I mean, by no means am I suggesting, by writing a book about the U.S. military, that every problem that America has a military solution.
Yeah, not everything's a nail. Not everything's a nail.
And I would actually argue, very consistently, like, I think our largest problems have nothing to do with the United States military.
Right.
That being said, our adversaries are clearly making investments in hard power, and we need to keep pace. And we need to do that smartly to ensure that the competition that we're moving into, kind of the more competitive world we're moving into, is a competition that stays peaceful. So that's kind of the way I'm looking at that, and just kind of put that off the table. I remember a great essay that I think it was Richard Posner wrote after the 9/11 Commission came out, and it was a review of the 9/11 Commission, and it had, the 9/11 Commission report had many expansive recommendations for what we should do. And he sort of said, no, I mean, actually, like, what we need to do is probably like put locks on cockpit doors, and sort of like basic things that we didn't do before. And like, there's a decent chance that we could have prevented 9/11 if we had done that stuff.
Right.
But like overhauling the intelligence process
right.
and sort of the war in Iraq and all these other
right.
things, like, probably not. I think there's a similar kind of very sober reflection that we're going to have to do whenever we come out of this horrific experience of COVID, to say, what are the things that we could have done better and differently that could have prevented this? I think a lot of it has to do with just political leadership and the mismanagement of this process, in the sense that we don't end up overreacting to what has been a horrible crisis, and do a lot of things that have very long effects, but ultimately might not have been necessary, because the real answer was very basic things like recognizing the problem when it actually happens. Like following directions that the government puts out about social distancing and things like that. I guess the broader point, though, is, look, the competition that I think we're in right now with China and certainly with Russia too, this is a strategic competition. It's a long-term competition. It's going to have every bit as much, if not more, to do with economics and information and, you know, education and sort of our values. To me, that is where America is strongest, and that's where I think we are going to compete most effectively, and that's where we're going to win. You look at Hong Kong, for example. I mean, you literally have people who want to leave Hong Kong because they do not want to live under, you know, what is kind of the coming authoritarianism of Beijing. We have ways of responding very smartly to that have nothing to do with the United States military, that have everything to do with our values as a country, our openness as a society, you know, kind of welcoming people, our history of welcoming people from overseas who are fleeing oppression, who want to establish themselves here in America, build new lives. And we've certainly seen that, you know, as dissidents and others have fled out of Russia. These are ultimately, I think, going to be our greatest sources of moral advantage. These are the ways that, you know, I would like to see us as a country, you know, kind of refocusing and getting back to an acknowledgement that this is ultimately the greatest source of our power. We still have to be able to prevent conflict. That's what my book's about. But ultimately, I think the way we succeed in these competitions is really going to be at that higher level of sort of what we are and what we represent as a country, as a people, as a society. That's the thing I'd like to see us getting back to.
Yeah, Eisenhower called it our spiritual strength.
Yes, it's a very good way of putting it.
Well, Chris, that's a terrific point to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's now just past 7 a.m. where you are, so you can go get some breakfast.
Sun's up.
Yeah, sun's up.
I can have some natural lighting.
Exactly. This is normally the part of the program where we would have folks line up for you to sign the book. But, you know, what I would encourage everyone to do is go online to, I would recommend your local bookseller, independent bookseller, and buy it. And this book's The Kill Chain. Highly recommended. It's a great read. Again, both a great sort of window into the making of U.S. defense policy, but also really a well-done wake-up call for what we need to do for the future. Chris, thanks so much for writing it. Thanks for taking the time for being with us. Thanks, everybody, for being part of this conversation, and I want everyone to have a great day. Thanks again.
Thanks, Derek.